She says she's carrying your baby, Daniel. The words left Margaret Thompson's mouth before she even realized she had spoken them aloud, and the dining room fell into a silence so complete that the ticking of the wall clock sounded louder than the Christmas music still humming softly from the kitchen speaker. Just minutes earlier, the house had been warm with the glow of string lights wrapped around the banister, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifting through the air, and the comfortable murmur of family gathered around a 12-seat oak table polished for the occasion. Snow had been falling steadily outside their Columbus, Ohio home, covering the lawn in a clean white blanket, the kind that usually made Margaret believe in fresh starts. At 68, she had hosted more Christmas dinners than she could count, each one carefully prepared down to the folded linen napkins and the heirloom china she only brought out once a year. She had carved the turkey herself, her hands steady despite the arthritis that sometimes flared in the cold, and she had smiled as her son Daniel poured wine into crystal glasses, his wife Emily adjusting the centerpiece so it looked just right for the photo she would inevitably post online. Everything had seemed perfect. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite, single chime. It was urgent, pressing, as if the person outside had been standing in the cold for too long. Margaret remembered the way Daniel froze mid-sentence, his hand hovering over the gravy boat, a flash of something unguarded crossing his face before he quickly masked it. Emily laughed lightly and said it was probably a neighbor dropping off cookies, but Margaret had already felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a winter storm changes direction. She rose from her chair and walked to the front door, her low heels tapping against the hardwood floor, each step measured. When she opened it, she saw a young woman standing on the porch, snow clinging to her dark wool coat, her long blonde hair damp at the ends. The girl looked no older than 24. Her cheeks were flushed from the 20-degree air, and one hand rested protectively over the unmistakable curve beneath her coat. She wasn't dressed for drama. She wasn't angry. She simply looked exhausted. "I need to speak with Daniel Thompson," she said, her voice trembling, but controlled. Margaret noticed the way she didn't look confused about the address. She knew exactly whose door she was knocking on. Behind Margaret, the house glowed with warmth and light. In front of her, the night felt sharp and unforgiving. For a moment, Margaret considered telling the girl she had the wrong house. It would have been easy. It would have protected the fragile peace of the evening. But something in the young woman's eyes stopped her. It wasn't desperation. It was certainty. Margaret stepped aside and allowed her to enter, the cold air rushing briefly into the foyer before the door clicked shut. From the dining room, Daniel stood slowly, his face drained of color. Emily's smile stiffened, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply looked at her son, at the man she had raised, and understood that whatever was about to unfold had been building long before this knock at the door. And in that instant, she realized this Christmas would divide her life into before and after. The front door had barely closed before the warmth of the house felt different, thinner somehow, as if the air itself understood it was no longer innocent. Margaret led the young woman into the foyer, noticing the faint tremble in her shoulders now that she was out of the wind. Up close, the girl looked even younger, her features soft, her eyes rimmed red from cold, and something else Margaret did not yet name. Daniel had stepped away from the dining table, his chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. Emily remained seated, though her posture had shifted, her spine straight, her smile carefully arranged as if she were still posing for a photograph. The rest of the family watched without speaking, forks suspended midair, the carved turkey cooling on the platter beneath the chandelier's warm light. "Her name is Hannah," Daniel said finally, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the easy confidence he carried at business dinners and neighborhood gatherings. He did not look at Margaret when he spoke. He looked at the floor. Margaret absorbed that detail quietly. She had raised her son to meet a person's eyes. The fact that he could not now told her more than any explanation would. Hannah removed her gloves slowly, revealing fingers slightly swollen from the cold, and clasped her hands together in front of her coat. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply stood there, carrying both the weight beneath her coat and the weight of the room's judgment. "I did not come to cause a scene," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "But he said he would tell you before Christmas. He said he would make things right." The phrase hung in the air. Make things right. Margaret felt the words settle into place like a piece of a puzzle she had not realized she had been assembling for months. There had been the late-night calls Daniel took on the back porch, claiming clients in different time zones. There had been unexplained withdrawals from his savings, subtle but consistent. There had been the growing distance between him and Emily, masked by public displays of unity that felt increasingly rehearsed. Margaret had noticed. She had chosen silence, believing it was not her place to interfere in her son's marriage. Now silence felt less like wisdom and more like avoidance. Emily rose at last, smoothing the front of her red sweater, as if adjusting fabric could restore order. "This is inappropriate," she said carefully, her tone measured but brittle at the edges. "Whatever this is, it does not belong at our Christmas table." Margaret watched the two young women closely. Hannah's hand moved instinctively to the curve of her abdomen, protective and unconscious. Emily's hands remained at her sides, fingers curled tightly inward. Daniel finally looked up, and for a brief second his eyes met his mother's. Margaret saw fear there, but also calculation, the quick mental search for a solution that would preserve the version of his life he preferred. She felt something inside her settle. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm. Outside, snow fell in soft, indifferent layers. Inside, Margaret understood that this was no sudden accident of fate. This was a truth that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to knock. Margaret did not invite anyone back to the table. Instead, she walked toward the living room and gestured for Hannah to sit on the edge of the cream-colored sofa near the fireplace, where the flames moved steadily behind the glass screen. The tree lights reflected in the window, casting small golden halos that felt almost ironic against the tension thickening inside the house. Daniel remained standing between the dining room and the living room, as if he had not decided which version of his life he intended to defend. Emily followed more slowly, each step controlled, her expression composed in a way that suggested effort rather than calm. The rest of the family pretended to return to their plates, though no one resumed eating. Silverware rested untouched beside cooling food. Margaret lowered herself into the armchair across from Hannah, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. "How far along are you?" she asked gently. 7 months, Hannah replied. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flickered briefly toward Daniel before returning to Margaret. "The doctor says everything looks healthy." The word healthy seemed to land heavily in the room, a quiet confirmation that this was not a misunderstanding that would fade away by morning. Margaret nodded once. 7 months meant this had begun in early spring, long before summer barbecues, long before the anniversary dinner Daniel and Emily had posted smiling photographs from downtown Columbus. Margaret remembered that evening. She had noticed how tightly Emily had held Daniel's arm in the picture, how his smile had not reached his eyes. She had dismissed the thought at the time. Now the memory rearranged itself into something sharper. "Does she know?" Emily asked suddenly, her tone cool but carefully restrained. She did not look at Hannah. She looked at Daniel. He swallowed before answering. "She found out in October," he said quietly. "October. 2 full months before Christmas. 2 months of shared dinners, weekend visits, polite conversations about holiday plans." Margaret felt the weight of that timeline more than the confession itself. The deception had not been impulsive. It had been sustained. Hannah reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a folded envelope. She held it out with both hands, not dramatically, not accusingly, simply offering proof. "He said he was going to talk to you," she said to Margaret. "He said he needed time to figure out how." Margaret accepted the envelope but did not open it immediately. She could feel the stiffness of ultrasound paper inside. She did not need to see it yet. She could already see the truth written across Daniel's face. Emily let out a slow breath through her nose, the sound barely audible but unmistakably sharp. "So what is it that you want?" she asked, her words precise. "Money? An apology? A public confession?" Hannah shook her head. "I want him to take responsibility," she answered. "For the baby. For what he promised." Margaret studied her carefully. There was no triumph in Hannah's expression. No satisfaction. Only exhaustion and resolve. Daniel finally stepped forward, running a hand through his hair the way he used to when he had broken a lamp as a boy and tried to calculate the consequences. But this was not a broken lamp. This was a life that would arrive in less than 3 months. Margaret looked from her son to the young woman carrying his child, and she understood that whatever decision came next would not only define Daniel's future, but her own place within it. Margaret finally opened the envelope. The ultrasound image was printed on thin glossy paper, slightly curled at the edges from being folded too tightly. She did not need medical training to recognize the small curved form on the screen, the profile faint but unmistakable. A due date was typed in the corner, February 18th. Less than 8 weeks away. She calculated it automatically, the way she once calculated grocery budgets and school schedules when Daniel was a child. 8 weeks was nothing. 8 weeks was a blink. She placed the image carefully on the coffee table, smoothing it flat with the palm of her hand. Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Mom," he began, his voice low, almost pleading, "it is complicated." Margaret looked up at him steadily. "A calendar is not complicated," she replied. 7 months is not complicated. Emily's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "You are taking her side already?" she asked, disbelief seeping into her tone. "We do not even know if this is true." Hannah inhaled slowly, as if preparing herself for that accusation. "He came to every appointment until October," she said quietly. "He knows it is true." The words were not loud, but they carried. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if hoping the moment might dissolve if he refused to look at it directly. Margaret remembered another winter decades ago, when Daniel had been 8 years old and tried to hide a failing math grade by slipping the report card into the trash. She had found it anyway. He had cried then, ashamed but still young enough to believe his mother could fix everything. Tonight there were no tears, only consequences. Margaret felt the weight of age settle over her shoulders, not as weakness, but as perspective. She had lived long enough to recognize patterns. Promises made in private. Delays disguised as planning. Silence used as a shield. She turned to Hannah. "Do your parents know?" she asked. Hannah shook her head. "They live in Michigan. I wanted him to tell his family first. He said Christmas would be the right time." Emily let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "So this was planned?" she asked Daniel. He did not answer immediately. That hesitation spoke louder than any confession. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, filling the gaps between their breathing. From the dining room came the faint clink of a fork being set down too firmly. Margaret folded her hands again, her mind moving beyond shock and into structure. A child was coming. That fact would not change based on embarrassment or social discomfort. She thought of the nursery she had once painted pale blue, of the long nights she had rocked Daniel to sleep in the same house that now held this fracture. Responsibility was not a slogan. It was action measured in years. She looked at her son, not as a boy who needed protection, but as a man accountable for his choices. "You will not solve this with silence," she said calmly. "And you will not ask me to pretend it does not exist." Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, the first visible sign that he understood the direction this was moving. Margaret did not know yet what decision she would make, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. No child connected to her blood would be treated as an inconvenience. Emily was the first to move. She stepped closer to Daniel, not touching him but positioning herself at his side, as if proximity alone could re-establish territory. "We need to discuss this privately," she said, her voice controlled but no longer warm. Margaret noticed the subtle shift in language. "Not we as a family. We as a couple." A line had been drawn, even if no one acknowledged it directly. Daniel looked between the two women in his life, his hesitation stretching the silence thin. "There is nothing private about a child," Margaret said. Evenly. "Not when it changes more than one household." The words were not loud, yet they settled with weight. Hannah remained seated, her back straight despite the fatigue visible in her face. The firelight flickered across her coat, still buttoned as if she was unsure whether she truly belonged inside. Margaret stood slowly and walked to the thermostat, adjusting it up by 2 degrees. The house had grown cooler, though no one had opened a window. She returned to her chair and folded her hands again, her posture calm, deliberate. "Daniel," she said, "you will answer clearly. Did you intend to leave your marriage?" The question was direct, stripped of emotion. Emily's jaw tightened. Hannah looked down at her hands. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I did not know what I intended," he admitted. "I thought I had time." Margaret studied him carefully. Time. That word again, as if life paused conveniently for indecision. She thought of the due date printed on the ultrasound. February 18th would arrive whether he felt ready or not. "And what do you intend now?" she asked. He ran a hand through his hair, searching for language that did not make him the villain in his own story. "I want to make sure the baby is taken care of," he said. "Financially, I will do what is necessary." Emily's eyes flashed. "Financially?" she repeated, the single word sharp. "Is that what you call it?" Hannah's gaze lifted, steady and unflinching. "I am not asking for luxury," she said quietly. "I am asking for acknowledgement." Margaret watched the exchange with growing clarity. This was no longer about shock. It was about positioning. Who would define the narrative? Who would absorb the consequences? Margaret rose again, this time walking to the dining room doorway. "Dinner is over," she said calmly to the relatives who had been pretending not to listen. "Please take dessert to the kitchen." There was relief in their compliance. Chairs moved. Plates clinked softly. The audience dissolved. When she returned to the living room, the space felt smaller but more honest. She picked up the ultrasound image once more and held it carefully. "This child," she said, her voice steady, "is not a scandal. It is a responsibility. And responsibility does not disappear because it arrived at an inconvenient time." Daniel looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if recognizing that the direction of the evening had shifted beyond his control. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not issue threats. But something had changed in her posture, in the quiet authority she carried. She was no longer reacting to a disruption. She was preparing to make decisions that would shape the future of everyone standing in that room. The house had grown unnaturally quiet, as if even the walls were listening. Margaret walked toward the front window and gently pulled the curtain aside. Snow continued to fall in slow, steady sheets, covering the driveway and the quiet suburban street in fresh white. It looked peaceful outside, untouched. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the three of them. Daniel stood near the fireplace now, his shoulders slightly slumped, as though the warmth offered no comfort. Emily remained upright and composed, but her eyes had sharpened, calculating, alert. Hannah still sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands resting protectively over her abdomen, her breathing measured and careful. Margaret felt the gravity of the moment settle fully into her chest. She had always believed that character revealed itself under pressure. Tonight, pressure had arrived uninvited. "Daniel," she said calmly, "you will not reduce this to a financial arrangement." He looked up quickly, defensive. "I am not reducing anything," he replied. "I am trying to be practical." Margaret tilted her head slightly. Practical would have been honesty in October. The words were not cruel. They were precise. Emily crossed her arms slowly. "So what do you suggest?" she asked. "Do you expect us to pretend this is acceptable?" Margaret held her gaze without blinking. "I expect accountability," she answered. "And I expect dignity. From all of you." Hannah swallowed but did not look away. Margaret could see the exhaustion in her face more clearly now, the subtle strain in the way she shifted her weight, as if her lower back ached from standing too long. 7 months pregnant in 20-degree weather had not been an impulsive visit. It had been a last attempt. Margaret walked to the kitchen and returned with a glass of water, handing it to Hannah without ceremony. "Thank you," Hannah said softly. Daniel watched that exchange closely, and something in his expression flickered. Perhaps guilt. Perhaps realization that his mother's loyalty would not be blind. Margaret resumed her seat. "This house," she said evenly, "has always stood for responsibility. When your father was alive, we agreed on one principle. We do not abandon what we create." Daniel's jaw tightened at the mention of his father. "I am not abandoning anyone," he insisted. "I just need time to figure out how to handle this without destroying everything." Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly. "Everything has already changed," she said. "You are simply deciding whether you will respond with integrity." Emily inhaled slowly, as if steadying herself. "And what about our marriage?" she asked, her voice finally revealing the strain beneath its polish. Margaret looked at her thoughtfully. "That is a question for the two of you," she replied. "But a marriage built on concealment will not survive silence." The clock on the wall struck 8, each chime echoing through the room. Margaret felt something shift within herself, a quiet transition from shock to resolve. She had spent decades nurturing her son, protecting him from mistakes that childhood allowed. But this was no longer childhood. This was consequence. She looked at Daniel once more, not with anger, but with expectation. "You will speak plainly," she said. "Not tomorrow. Not next week. Tonight." And in the stillness that followed, Daniel understood that the version of himself his mother once defended would not shield him now. Daniel remained standing in the center of the living room, as if the floor beneath him had narrowed to a single square foot. The fire continued to burn, steady and indifferent, casting light across faces that no longer resembled a holiday gathering. He looked first at Emily, then at Hannah, and finally at his mother. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the confidence Margaret had once admired in boardrooms and public events. "I met Hannah in March," he said slowly. "It started as a friendship. I convinced myself it was harmless." Emily let out a quiet breath that trembled at the edges, but she did not interrupt. Daniel continued, choosing each word carefully as though clarity might soften the impact. "By May, it was no longer harmless. I told myself I was confused. I told myself I needed space. But I did not tell the truth to either of you." The admission settled heavily in the room. Hannah did not look surprised. Emily's composure thinned further, though she held her posture upright. Margaret listened without blinking, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "When Hannah told me she was pregnant in September, I panicked," Daniel went on. "I thought I could fix it quietly. I thought if I kept things stable at home, I could find a solution without destroying everything." Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly at that word again. Solution. As if a child were a logistical inconvenience. "And what was the solution?" she asked calmly. Daniel swallowed. "I did not have one," he admitted. "I just kept delaying." Hannah's voice entered gently but firmly. "You said you loved me," she said. There was no accusation in her tone, only exhaustion. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I said things I believed in the moment," he replied. "But I was not brave enough to act on them." Emily finally stepped forward. "So we were both placeholders?" she asked, her voice steady but wounded beneath the surface. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that silence answered for him. Margaret felt something shift decisively inside her. Not anger, not grief, clarity. She rose from her chair once more, the movement deliberate and unhurried. "You were not confused," she said to her son. "You were comfortable. You wanted the stability of your marriage and the attention of something new. You believed time would protect you from consequences." Daniel did not protest. The truth had stripped him of that defense. Outside, a snowplow passed slowly down the street, its low mechanical hum briefly filling the quiet. Life continued beyond these walls. Margaret turned to Hannah. "Have you prepared for February?" she asked gently. Hannah nodded. "I have a small apartment near Riverside Hospital," she said. "I work part-time. I have savings, but it will not be enough for long." Margaret absorbed the information carefully. Practical details mattered. Emily looked from one to the other, realization dawning that the center of gravity in the room had shifted away from marital optics and toward future responsibility. Daniel finally lifted his head and looked directly at his mother. In his eyes was not defiance now, but uncertainty. Margaret met that look with unwavering steadiness. The time for avoidance had ended. The next decision would not be his alone. Margaret moved toward the hallway and retrieved her late husband's leather folder from the cabinet near the study. She carried it back into the living room without explanation and placed it carefully on the coffee table beside the ultrasound image. Daniel washed her hands, recognition dawning slowly. Inside that folder were not sentimental letters or photographs. It contained documents, the deed to the house, the terms of the family trust, the investment accounts that Daniel had always assumed would eventually pass quietly into his management. Margaret sat down again and rested her palms on the folder as if anchoring the conversation to something solid. "When your father and I created the trust," she began calmly, "we included a clause about character and responsibility. Assets are not transferred automatically. They are reviewed." Daniel's posture stiffened. Emily's eyes flicked toward the folder, understanding arriving quickly. Hannah remained still, uncertain but attentive. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "this is not about money." Margaret held his gaze. "Everything is about responsibility," she replied. "And responsibility includes how a man treats his family." The room felt smaller now, not because of proximity, but because the future had entered it fully formed. Margaret opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper, not to threaten, but to clarify. "The trust allows me discretion," she said evenly. "If I believe a beneficiary is acting in a way that endangers the integrity of the family, I can delay distribution." Daniel's breathing shifted almost imperceptibly. He had built part of his business with the assumption that those funds would strengthen his expansion next year. Emily understood that as well. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I will not finance avoidance," she said. "If you choose integrity, you will have support. If you choose concealment, you will not." Hannah looked at Margaret with a mixture of surprise and relief. No one had defended her so plainly before. Daniel stepped forward, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "You would cut me off?" he asked quietly. Margaret shook her head once. "I would pause and evaluate," she answered. "Just as I have tonight." The distinction mattered. This was not punishment. It was accountability. Emily crossed her arms again, but this time her expression was less confrontational and more uncertain. She had always believed control rested in presentation, in maintaining appearances. Margaret had just shifted the axis entirely. "What do you want him to do?" Emily asked, her voice lower now. Margaret looked at Daniel. "I want you to state, clearly, whether you intend to acknowledge your child publicly and legally. I want you to establish support. Before February. I want you to stop hiding behind delay." The fire crackled softly, punctuating the silence that followed. Outside, the snowplow passed again, clearing the street in steady lines. Paths could be made, Margaret thought, but only if someone chose to move forward. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of decision settling onto him at last. For the first time that evening, he no longer looked like a man searching for escape. He looked like a man standing at a crossroads. And Margaret knew that whichever direction he chose, the family would not return to what it had been an hour ago. Daniel stood motionless for several seconds, the firelight casting long shadows across the walls behind him. The folder on the coffee table seemed to anchor the entire room, a quiet reminder that decisions had structure and consequences. He drew in a slow breath and looked first at Hannah, then at Emily, and finally at his mother. "I will acknowledge the child," he said at last, his voice steady but subdued. "Publicly and legally. I will arrange support before February. I will not pretend this does not exist." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Hannah's shoulders lowered slightly, the first visible sign that the tension she had been holding all evening had begun to ease. Emily closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the finality of what had just been declared. Margaret watched her son carefully, measuring not only the content of his statement but the tone behind it. There was no pride in his expression, only acceptance. "And your marriage?" Margaret asked quietly, not as an accusation, but as a necessary extension of the truth. Daniel hesitated, then spoke with more clarity than he had all night. "That is something Emily and I will decide together. But I will not lie to her again." Emily opened her eyes and studied him for a long moment. The polished composure she had maintained throughout the evening had softened into something more human, less curated. "Honesty would have been a better Christmas gift," she said evenly. There was pain in her voice, but also resolve. Margaret stood slowly, feeling the ache in her knees as a reminder of her years, and walked to the mantel above the fireplace. She adjusted one of the framed photographs of Daniel as a boy, his missing front tooth visible in a wide grin. Life had once been simple in that picture. Now it required deliberate choices. She turned back toward them. "Then tonight marks the end of secrecy," she said calmly. "Not the end of family, but the end of illusion." The clock read 8:30. The snow outside had slowed, leaving the street cleared and quiet. Margaret walked to the front door and opened it briefly, allowing a breath of cold air to enter. It felt sharp and clean against her skin. She closed it again and faced Hannah. "You will not drive back alone tonight," she said gently. "The roads are slick, and you should not be on them at this hour. The guest room is ready." Hannah blinked in surprise. "I do not want to intrude," she replied softly. "You are not intruding," Margaret answered. "You are carrying my grandchild." The statement settled firmly in the room, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive. Daniel looked at his mother with something new in his eyes. Not fear, not resistance, respect. Emily exhaled slowly, her arms uncrossing at her sides. The future remained uncertain, complex, and undoubtedly difficult. But the direction had shifted. Margaret returned to her chair one last time and placed her hand on the leather folder, closing it gently. The documents inside would remain where they were for now. Tonight had not been about punishment. It had been about clarity. And as the house settled into a quieter, more honest stillness, Margaret understood that the true inheritance she would protect was not money, but accountability.